So connective tissue is the most abundant and widespread of all of these primary tissue types. Connective tissue is really two things that kind of help us define connective tissue. One, they all originate from the mesoderm, right? Not ectoderm or endoderm, but that kind of inner layer in early embryonic development, the mesoderm, right? So all connective tissues have this mesoderm origin. The other thing that kind of lets connective tissue stand out is that the matrix is what dominates this tissue type. So in epithelial tissue, we saw that it was so cellular, and we'll see a lot of cells when we move on to muscle tissue and nervous tissue. In connective tissue, there are cells, but it's really the matrix that stands out, right? Now, some people, when they talk about the matrix, they break this down into two categories. This like weird term, I've got to say, called ground substance, and this is really just this like unstructured material that kind of fits in these spaces around the cells, and the fibers, right? So in connective tissue, we have three different types of fibers. Here we see collagen fibers. All of these fibers are proteins. Collagen fibers are really amazing. It's actually three different protein strands that are kind of cross-linked together. They are extremely strong, at least in one direction. In fact, a lot of people would argue they're stronger than steel as far as like the loads that they can support. And I will say that's actually the cool thing here with connective tissue, because cells get damaged, right? But matrix is non-cellular, and that's what allows connective tissue to withstand stresses that no other tissue could handle, right? As far as like stretch, compression, weight, abrasion, like all sorts of different factors. Connective tissue is really good at providing strength. So we've got, sorry, I digress. Collagen fibers, they're also showing elastic fibers. And these elastic fibers that are stained dark there, this is made out of another protein. It's called elastin. And they are much stretchier, and they actually provide this recoil. So we might see that more of those fibers in something like a blood vessel that needs to come back to the same size. And then kind of similar to these elastic fibers, there's kind of short web-like fibers. Those are called reticular fibers. Right? And so the fibers that make up connective tissue are collagen, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. Again, the ground substance, a little more amorphous. You might fit, actually, extracellular fluid actually fits in this category. And another thing that makes up a lot of this is a group of molecules called proteoglycans. Now, I don't want to go too far here, but some of you might recognize this, right? So maybe from the term we can tell that it is a protein and some kind of sugar attached. These are actually really important in drawing water into this matrix, right? So this extracellular fluid is there because of these proteoglycans. You might recognize a couple as things like chondroitin, if you've seen that in Natural Grocer. Chondroitin, or hyaluronic acid, right? Both of these are important proteoglycans, right? So matrix, again, matrix is what dominates, but we do have cells in connective tissue as well. Cells are actually who are producing these different fibers. Now, the cell type depends on which particular connective tissue we're talking about, and connective tissue is going to fall into 4 categories. So we've got what's called connective tissue proper, and the dominant cell type in connective tissue proper is what's called a fibroblast. Sorry, I'm realizing I might not even be on the screen here. Let's try on this side. Connective tissue proper. And the dominant cell type there is a fibroblast. Another category of connective tissue is what's called cartilage. And the dominant cell type there are chondrocytes or chondroblasts. And we'll talk about, I'll just be consistent here, chondroblast, and we'll talk about these word endings. We also have bone. Osteoblasts are the cell type. Ooh, and then our 4th category of connective tissue is actually blood. Now, no one ever likes this, but blood originates from the mesoderm, right? And it is primarily extracellular fluid, right? That is the plasma, right? So this is one of our connective tissues. And the cell type here is actually a stem cell. This would never actually enter, well, shouldn't really enter your bloodstream. It's actually in the bone marrow where the blood is being produced, right? So we have some of these stem cells, the erythroblast would be an example there of like a red blood cell in development. Now, notice when I wrote these cell types, they all end in blast. And I should say that if you see that ending blast, it indicates typically a young cell that's producing lots of matrix. Right? So when these cells are young, they are just cranking out the fibers, whether that's collagen, elastic, reticular, whatever is needed in their particular tissue type. And then we will see that ending of the word actually switch as the cell gets older and less active, right? We would then go to fibrocyte, chondrocyte, osteocyte, right? Erythrocyte is the name of the red blood cell, right? So keep that in mind, the endings of these cell types changes as well. Okay, so that's kind of big picture connective tissue, right? What it is to be a connective tissue. But we see that we have these 4 types of connective tissue. So we need to dig a little deeper. If we really want to get into, okay, what are the functions of connective tissue? There's actually a lot of variation depending on which of these connective tissues that we're in. So we are going to run through it. Maybe I'll leave, let's do this. Let's leave these 4 types of connective tissue just so we can kind of check in on where we are as we move through these. Okay. Connective tissue proper. Oh, sorry, this is actually a really nice picture, microscopic image, and then kind of the cartoon visual of connective tissue. Again, notice there are some cells, but there's a lot of like open space. You can see fibers. We can't necessarily tell what's in that space. Is it extracellular fluid or some of these other components, right? But there's like random adipocytes floating around. White blood cells kind of move in and out of these connective tissues. And so this is really actually a cool group of tissues that I think are underappreciated for what they can do. Okay, off my soapbox and on to connective tissue proper. Now, connective tissue proper, there's actually 6 different connective tissues that we're going to talk about. 3 of them are considered loose connective tissue proper, and 3 of them are considered dense. So let's just lay that out real quick. So in loose, we have these 3: areolar, adipose, and reticular. Right, and again, this is from figure 411, those 3 types of loose connective tissue proper. Dense, we get dense regular connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue, and elastic connective tissue, right? So this is where we're heading in connective tissue proper. So here we see our 3 examples of loose connective tissue. Now, the primary difference here is that what we'll see in loose connective tissue is that it's really the fibers that are the primary element. There is a lot, sorry, I said that wrong. Space is the primary thing. There is lots of open space. We see fibers, we see cells, but there is a lot of space in here. Okay, so in areolar connective tissue, the big thing here, if we look at the cells, it is a fibroblast that's the main cell in areolar connective tissue, and the fibers are very loosely arranged. Areolar connective tissue ends up being this really nice reservoir for water, right? And some of that can be at like a normal level. This is also a place where if you had swelling, say you like twisted your ankle or something like that, and all these fluids come into the space, right? Typically they're going to move into and expand that areolar connective tissue. Again, areolar connective tissue, it's going to be often found kind of holding different tissues together, binding them, but also allowing movement. Here's a couple other pictures for you. Again, actual microscopic image and then kind of a cartoonized version. They're trying to point out here that there are collagen fibers, right, those really strong proteins, but then also quite a few of these elastic fibers, right, so a little bit of stretch and recoil, and those fibroblasts that are producing these proteins. Okay, reticular connective tissue, right? Notice when you look at this, and you're doing this in lab as well, how much open space there is, right? So space is the dominant thing in these loose connective tissue propers. In this case, it's really, like the name suggests, it's these reticular fibers. Now the reticular fibers, they're shorter, they're more web-like, and that actually explains why we find this particular connective tissue in organs like the spleen, the liver, bone marrow. They're basically going to act as like scaffolding for cells to sit in. So if you picture like the bone marrow, you might have lots of developing blood cells kind of hanging out amongst these reticular fibers then that are supporting them, right? So a lot of times we'll find it in some of these organs, and we refer to like the meat of that organ is the stroma, the framework, and it really is these reticular fibers that are then supporting the cells there. Okay, our third loose connective tissue is adipose. Adipose is fat, right? Adipocytes are these really unique cells. They're highly specialized in order to store large amounts of lipids. And they store those lipids in the form of triglycerides, which the body can then mobilize those lipids later and use as a source of energy. If you recall from nutrition class, lipids hold about 9 kilocalories per gram, as opposed to carbohydrates and proteins, which are only 4. So we can actually carry a lot more energy with a lot less weight by using adipose. So as a connective tissue, right, we'll find this in a few different places. We definitely have what we call subcutaneous adipose, and that's just deep to the skin. This is actually really important adipose for cushioning, for insulation, and also energy storage. Now, when those subcutaneous locations kind of fill up, we can also then pack adipose around our internal organs, right? Then we might refer to it as visceral fat, right? That can actually start to get damaging, right? It's kind of packing around the organs and can impede their function. But our bodies have this actual like massive ability to store energy, right? Body fat can be anywhere from like 10 to 50%, even more, of our body weight, and it's really primarily about storing energy for later. I will mention this as well. A lot of times people then think about adipose as just kind of like this storage container that's not super important. Adipose is highly vascular, right? And what scientists are starting to understand is how really metabolically active it is, right? We might be adding new fatty acids all the time, but pulling other fatty acids out, right? And so this high level of vascularization indicates that it's pretty metabolically active. It's also now considered an endocrine organ, so it's actually sending signals to your brain and other parts of the body to indicate kind of how much energy do we have stored, how are we doing here. Okay, so those are our 3 loose connective tissues: areolar, adipose, and reticular. Okay, let's take a look then at our dense. Okay. Ooh, look at that. Okay, ready? Loose connective tissue, look at how much white kind of open space there is versus dense. That should be a really obvious difference as you're looking at these in lab even. In dense connective tissues, the fibers are what dominates, right? In loose, it's the open space, right, of the matrix. And in dense, it's actually the fibers, the proteins of the matrix that make up that kind of primary element. All right, 3 different forms: dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. Dense regular connective tissue, what makes it regular is that we're going to see all of these collagen fibers running in the same direction. So this is a classic example of dense regular connective tissue. Is going to be things like tendons and ligaments. Ooh, what's the difference? So they're both connecting things. Tendons connect muscle to bone, and then ligaments connect bone to bone. Right, other things you might include in here like fascia. If you've heard of fascia, it kind of encases different groups of muscles together, right? If you got tendons and ligaments, that's totally fine. Okay? So dense, regular, connective tissue. Because these all run in parallel, because these all run the same direction, they are extremely strong, right? There's a little bit of give in tendons, a little bit of stretch, but you can hit a point where you exceed that ability to stretch. You can exceed their ability to hold. You actually can tear tendons and ligaments, right? If anyone's torn an ACL, they might be familiar with that. Okay, dense irregular connective tissue then, it's still packed with those fibers, but now all of our collagen fibers are running in all of these different kind of crazy directions. The classic example of where you find this is in the dermis. So just under the epidermis, under that epithelial layer, you've got the dermis, which is dense irregular connective tissue. And because we've got collagen fibers running in lots of different planes, we can actually absorb stress in lots of different directions, which is what they're trying to show here. So another place you might find that is like in a joint capsule, the connective tissue wrapping that ball and socket joint in your shoulder has to be able to kind of move in lots of different directions. Okay. Elastic connective tissue, again, lots of fibers here. The elastic fibers are stained dark here. We tend to find this in places like blood vessels, particularly, say, the aorta that has to stretch to kind of accommodate this huge amount of blood leaving the heart with each beat, and then recoil to its original shape, right? So elastic connective tissue, the last of our dense connective tissue proper, is really dominated by these elastic fibers. Okay, so we're done with connective tissue proper. We looked at 3 loose connective tissue propers and 3 dense types of connective tissue proper. And now we're into cartilage. So we'll look at those 3 types, and then it gets super easy. We move into bone and blood. So in cartilage, right, and we'll get into depth of the 3 types, but kind of if you think about cartilage overall, it's this really remarkable tissue that can really withstand both compression, right, and also tension. Part of why it can do this is it holds an awful lot of water, and that's going to be a lot of the supportive material here. Even though it doesn't seem aqueous, that water is going to give us a lot of really the strength against compression. Other things here in cartilage, like epithelial tissue, cartilage is avascular. Right? It does not have a blood supply. Now this is definitely going to make it a tissue that has a harder time regenerating, right? It doesn't have as much access to nutrients. The nutrients that it does get, right, there are cells, they do need oxygen and glucose and those sorts of things. The nutrients they get are going to be through diffusion from the perichondrium. Right? The perichondrium, peri like perimeter, and this prefix chondro is always indicating cartilage. This perichondrium is just a wrapper that goes around the cartilage. Maybe you've heard of periosteum, the wrapper on bones. This is really similar, and the nutrients are going to have to come from here. I mentioned that cartilage has a really high water component, and one of the reasons that this is, the matrix has a lot of those proteoglycans that we talked about when we first introduced connective tissues. Things like hyaluronic acid or glucosaminoglycans, right? I'm fine if you refer to them as proteoglycans, but remember it's this protein sugar molecule, right? Kind of a combination of the two, and it really attracts the water. It draws it into these spaces between the cells. So, and speaking of the cells then, the cell, right, because this is all matrix, right, that we're looking at here. The cells we call chondrocytes. Right? Site means cell, chondro indicates cartilage. Again, there are chondroblasts when they're immature and making matrix. Mature cartilage cells are called chondrocytes. So let's go ahead and look through our 3 different varieties of cartilage. Our first one is hyaline cartilage, right? Hyaline cartilage is just a beautiful tissue, right? Kind of this glossy, amorphous appearance with these little, beads or eyes, those are actually chondrocytes, right? But this is a really nice connective tissue for how it can withstand compression. Really, the cells in hyaline cartilage are less than 10% of the actual tissue. The rest is going to be matrix. Here they're showing you one of the places that you would find hyaline cartilage. This is the rings on your trachea and bronchi that actually hold your airway open. Another place that you would find hyaline cartilage is as articular cartilage, right? And articulation is a joint, right? If arthritis, if you recognize that prefix. So this articular cartilage, what we're seeing here is that the ends of the long bones, right? Bones in your arms and legs, the ends are covered in this hyaline cartilage that's going to make a nice smooth surface for that joint to move on. The other place are epiphyseal plates. Now, you've heard of epiphyseal plates, but you may have called them growth plates. And this is basically in a long bone. Let's make it like a dog bone here, right? But pretend that's your femur, right? So you have that articular cartilage on the ends where it's going to meet another bone. This epiphyseal plate is in here, and what happens is while you're still growing, this plate is made of hyaline cartilage, and it keeps growing and then getting replaced with bone. And so it's as that cartilage lengthens, the bone lengthens, you get taller, and then eventually that plate is going to close, which means all the hyaline cartilage is gone, it's been converted to bone, and you can no longer extend that bone, you can no longer grow. So some really important places that we'll find hyaline cartilage. Elastic cartilage, as you might expect, right, has more elastic fibers. We still see our chondrocytes hanging out and the large amount of matrix surrounding them, but that now has many more elastic fibers. So remember, that's anytime you need to stretch and recoil. And so here we see the outer ear, the pinea, right? You push it one way and it flops right back. That's the elastic tissue. The other really important place is the epiglottis. The epiglottis is a little flap of elastic cartilage that's between your trachea and your esophagus. So it covers the trachea, the windpipe, every time you swallow so that you don't inhale your food. You're not supposed to inhale your food. When that doesn't work, you start choking on things. Okay, the last cartilage type then is fibrocartilage. And structurally, fibrocartilage is kind of this intermediate so it's like a structural intermediate between hyaline cartilage and dense regular connective tissue. So let's see what they mean by that, right? So as you look at fibrocartilage, you see these rows of chondrocytes that look very much like hyaline cartilage. Let me flip back, right? You see it. So that portion is very much like hyaline cartilage, lots of water, compression, resistance, those sorts of things, but it's interspersed with these bands of collagen fibers that are all running in parallel, just like you'd see in dense regular connective tissue, right? And that's going to give this cartilage some really unique properties as far as what it can withstand with stretch and also compression. So the examples where you would find this, this is an intervertebral disc. And so if you think about how your spinal column works, right, as you're walking around and it's carrying weight, you want that compression resistance, right, that you might get from something like a hyaline cartilage, but you also want to be able to flex and bend much more like dense regular connective tissue, much more like tendons, right? And so fibrocartilage is a really kind of useful, unique cartilage here. The other place you would find it is in what's called a meniscus. So in your knee, between the femur and the tibia, you have this extra little plate of fibrocartilage to help absorb the stresses of impact. So that is your fibrocartilage. Okay, so cartilage, that doesn't seem too bad, right, after connective tissue proper. This is gonna get even easier. Let's look at bone and then blood, our final connective tissue. So bone, also known as osseous tissue, is a connective tissue, but it's a hard connective tissue, right? And so what happens here is the cell here, we have an osteoblast. Remember, blast means immature secreting matrix. What these osteoblasts produce are lots of collagen fibers, right? So this sounds familiar so far. But then they're also going to encourage the deposition of minerals, of calcium phosphate, right, onto that collagen. So they build the collagen and then the calcium phosphate deposits and hardens this tissue. Now our little osteoblast who was building this suddenly finds himself kind of walled off, stuck, right? All these little black dots here are what we call lacuna or pits. And the osteoblasts are now stuck in this little pit. They can no longer do their job. So they don't secrete matrix, they're mature, we call them osteocytes, okay? The other thing that you see on here, right, the bone gets this repeating pattern. It almost looks like the trunk of a tree, right, tree rings. Each of those rings is called an osteon. And what you can't see on this picture is that central canal actually has a blood vessel, and there's lots of branching blood vessels going on. Bone is actually highly vascular. Which is going to make it much better at repairing itself, right? Sometimes we say it's better to actually break a bone than to tear a ligament, for example, just because of how easily they are to repair. What else about bone? Oh, what's it for, right? Structural support. Hold you upright, right? Structural support. And then also protection. So if you think about some parts of your skeleton, maybe the skull, the ribs, the pelvis, right? They're all protecting important internal organs. Okay, last but not least, we've got blood. Now, blood, I'm showing you here just some of the cells in the blood. Blood is the one that people don't want it to be a connective tissue. Right? But look at blood. Blood is primarily matrix, and in this case we call that matrix plasma, and plasma is like 98% water, right? But the matrix makes up over half of this tissue, right? And so that leads us to think connective tissue, and also blood originates from the mesoderm, that middle germ layer during embryonic development, right? So it is, in fact, a connective tissue. It's a connective tissue that just happens to be specialized for transport, right? And so we've got, right, we do have matrix, we've got cells. Leave space, let's talk about transport. We've got cells, right? You're probably already familiar with red blood cells, white blood cells. And so as we think about transport, those red blood cells are carrying oxygen and CO2 throughout the body. The white blood cells are being carried around the body, and those are your defense system, so helping prevent infection, fight infection, things like that. And then also in the blood, we're just carrying all sorts of nutrients, right? Things like glucose, maybe some different ions. And so blood, we have a whole chapter on blood in AMP2, but it is in fact a connective tissue. Okay, there's connective tissues. So again, a couple questions for you to think about. We can talk about these answers in class. And let's go ahead and wrap up tissues. Okay, so nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is made up of neurons. Just recapping. For tissues, we had epithelium, connective tissue, which we just completed. We're going to talk about nervous tissue and then muscle. And we're through the tissues. Okay, so nervous tissue, it's made up of neurons. These are those specialized cells that are actually carrying electrical impulses and communicating with distant parts of the body. And then also what are called the neuroglia, or sometimes you'll just see them called glia or glial cells. Okay, and these are support cells. We'll talk about this more when we actually get to the nervous system. Really the star of the show here is the neuron. They've got one end, those are the dendrites that are actually receiving input. The body of that neuron is going to make some kind of decision, and then it can send output down this long axon to communicate with other cells. So nervous tissue is really unique. I think you'll enjoy learning about that more later this semester as well. There's an actual histology image. Again, there's the neuron. These are the nuclei of those glial cells, the support cells. Cartoon version, you're going to love it. There's astrocytes, ependymal cells, oligodendrocytes, all these support cells helping out the neurons. Don't worry about learning those names at this point. We can do that when we get to the actual nervous system. Look at that. So easy, right? I started out with the epithelium and the connective tissue because they're the hard ones. Okay, so the last tissue type we want to go over then is muscle tissue. Now there are three types of muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Yeah, there we go. Look at, these are some really nice actual microscopic images of that muscle. When we look at skeletal muscle, we say that it's striated, right? It almost looks like a piece of fish or something. What you're looking at are these repeating bands of two proteins called actin and myosin. Right? And actin and myosin actually move past each other. That is what causes contraction. And so you're just seeing bands of that. Now in skeletal muscle, every cell can actually have multiple nuclei. Really that just happens in development. These are long cells that are actually a fusion of multiple cells during development. And their purpose, of course, primarily is to move your skeleton. Right? So there they're showing you a picture, right? We think of skeletal muscle as saying like our bicep or something like that. Okay, cardiac muscle then is found in the heart. It shares some properties. It is still striated. I'll show you that one again. It's still striated. It's not as obvious, but there are striations there. Typically only one nucleus, but not always. And the other thing that this cartoon kind of shows nicely is, do you see how these cells actually kind of branch? So that's unique in cardiac muscle, that the cells branch. Between adjacent cells, we have this structure called an intercalated disc. And really what's happening here, right, is you have this junction of two cells, and we have gap junctions that are built in here so that ions can pass from one cell to the next. So when the heart contracts, that message to contract actually flows through the heart basically as one. All those cells are connected, and that shows up in microscopic image as those intercalated discs. Wait for it. So you can actually see those on these microscope slides as well. Okay, and that cardiac muscle, of course, is not moving your skeleton, but instead it's pumping blood throughout the body. All right, our last muscle then is called smooth muscle, and this is going to look really different. It is not striated. It is not striated. Each cell has a single central nucleus, and now instead of being some big long cell or a branch cell, they're kind of these little they call it fusiform, or I don't know, maybe like you could draw it like a football or something like that, with a single central nucleus. Okay. It's not moving the skeleton, of course. Instead, it's going to be moving things like your internal organs, right? We'll find this a lot in the digestive tract. It's actually really important in blood vessels as well. Here they're showing digestive tract. Okay, so skeletal, cardiac, smooth muscle, done.